Can I show you a desk? Show mine. I actually hate being over there. I guess I should be over there. I so hate being over here. All right. I guess he's gonna bring my stuff back. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm starting my class again because I thought I was actually going to have a session where I'm not recorded or not live, but that didn't happen. So here I go. So by way of introduction, my name is Shasta Tricomoxy. For those of you who may not know me, I'm an attorney by profession who fell into compliance.
Sounds like me.
Just a little bit of history so you get a little background on me, you know, who's teaching you. I left practice to go to be the first in-house counsel at Credit Suisse. And at the time, we had a CEO who thought that, and it was good for me, that everybody should learn banking, no matter how they're coming into the organization. They need to learn the A's and A to Z's of banking. And so during my first 6 months to a year at Credit Suisse, I went through every department to learn how every department works, which was good because being the in-house, you have to understand how things work. At that stage too, compliance, I'll give you a little history. Don't worry about the grades. These are all due to my employer. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. When I left practice, which was in the late 1990s to go into the offshore sector, compliance was really something new. It was in its infancy stage, particularly here in the Bahamas, and technically the rest of the world as well. Some places were a little bit more developed than we were, but obviously, you know, we didn't have our legislative full framework in like we have now. And so it was a learning experience for everybody. Back then we had really what are called industry guidelines as to how we conducted ourselves. Back then AIBT guidelines was the way we, you know, determine what kind of policies and procedures we were putting in place because we didn't have the legislative structure. And unfortunately for me, the compliance officer left. And next thing I know, I was a compliance officer too. So that's how I fell into compliance. Some of you may know me as a past president of BACO. Yes, I was past president of BACO. I'm actually one of the founding members of BACO with Cheryl Bazard, and there was a couple of us like Endrick Delaveau and Robin Scavella, Tanya McCartney, who most of you know from BSFB. So that being said, I never seem to be able to get out of compliance. I actually went back to practice for a while, for about 5 years at Higson Johnson, and then went back into the offshore center, and I'm back in compliance. So I tell you, I keep getting back in there. And obviously, yes, I have done the ICA myself, part of the whole organization when BACO and BIFs worked together to with ICA to bring the course here. And so somehow I end up teaching it as well. So I haven't had any of you guys, so I mean, if you guys could just introduce yourselves, that would be great. You want to start for me?
Charlene Marshall.
Okay. Where are you?
I'm an accountant at Nautical Insurances.
Okay.
Bianca Rami, attorney at the Compliance Commission.
Okay.
Amanda Ferguson with Trust and Estates.
Okay.
Rod Collins with the FIU analyst.
Okay.
Serena Steve, the CIBC president.
Excellent.
Kia Calendar, CIBC, First Caribbean Compliance Department.
Okay. And then we'll go back.
Okay, Bridget Butler, attorney at law, sole practitioner.
Okay.
Main focus litigation, no information of.
So you gotta do your own compliance. Okay.
Tana Tayazil. I work at Marv's Auto Center.
Okay. Cool.
Karen Sayers, I'm an attorney at Atlantic Speaking.
Okay.
Morning, Gardner. Attorney also Atlantic Speaking.
Okay.
Pamela Farrington, I'm patent investment accounting/legal.
Okay.
Gordon Ward, Delta.
Awesome. Introduce yourself and tell me where you're at.
Okay, Raquel Trotman, Central Bank.
Okay, well, I'm glad I have a mixture of everybody. And just from the mixture that we have here, we could see how compliance has really affected every industry that we have, right? And so with that, I'm going to start and do your part. I'm going to do fully Unit 6 today and part of Unit 7. So I'm hoping that you guys read something. All right? Okay, that being said, obviously, we're dealing with terrorist financing and proliferation financing. Now, I always ask people this at the beginning. Who knows what proliferation is? It's a big word that doesn't give you a clue of what it's for. Nobody? The previous classes know I usually have a bag of candy and I reward people for who answer in my class. Unfortunately today, and I'm apologizing in advance because BPL was not working with me this morning. So if I was not coordinated or my hair is a little bit out of place, I blame it on BPL because it actually didn't come on until I was about to leave the house.
Yeah.
So obviously I had to stop to get my cup of coffee because then I needed something to rejuvenate me. Even though I will tell you that I'm usually this hyper. Okay? So, with that being said, I will bring my candy next time. I always have my bag of candy, but I didn't have time to refill my bag of candy, which the other group helped me to deplete to zero. So, I will have a scribe who will have to make a note. Would you like to be my scribe for me, please? And let me know who's supposed to get reward next week.
I know the names.
Okay, well, we'll ask. How about that? So, proliferation, anybody want to hazard a guess? Oh, I didn't mean to quiet you all down.
I'll try.
Awesome. Nothing, hey, listen, it's always best to try.
She told me to try.
Awesome. I'm with you. And listen, I will tell you that First Caribbean has been pretty good in my classes. I can't remember his name now. He was glasses. He usually sits around. Yes.
Listen, he works with me too.
Okay, you can tell him I didn't bring my candies.
I'll let him know.
Yes.
I'll give him your candy. So I get it right.
Okay.
Proliferation means to obtain or facilitate the use of
Mm-hmm.
or finance the use of
Okay.
in terms of weapons.
Yes.
of mass destruction.
Correct. That's all it means. It's a big word, meaning something quite simple. So really what you're doing is assisting persons to either fund or to get the materials, for example, for weapons of mass destruction.
So it's like crowdfunding.
Let me give you a clear example. We have a certain young leader in the Pacific who is in charge of a communist country. Anybody knows what that country is? Yes, Korea. Who said Korea? Okay, my boy at the back. What's your name? Ward.
Kia.
Kia. So there you all get your reward.
K-E.
Make sure I get it right? Okay. So Kim Jong is obviously trying to build weapons of mass destruction. And obviously the rest of the world doesn't want him to build weapons of mass destruction, so that the rest of us become in fear that he may decide one day, you know, him and Trump may have an argument, and next thing we know, the rest of the world is being blown up. All right? We are part of the fallout, unfortunately. Right? So it is really to stop him being able to have the capability in any way to either start or continue with a program to construct weapons of mass destruction. Make sense? So, with that, we have a whole regime that we have to look at that includes proliferation. All right? And obviously terrorist financing. So, did they bring me any markers? Oh, yes, they did. Okay. So, terrorist financing. Most countries have been, well, the Bahamas being a little exception, but a lot of the larger countries have been affected for years now with persons who wish to achieve their political gain or political ideology by force. And part of getting other people to get on board with them, you may find that they target persons by blowing the place up. That's technically what they're doing. So you have certain countries who have had to experience this for a lot more years than the rest of us. So let's think about it. You have people like the UK, the US, right? Who else?
Trinidad.
Trinidad, okay, yes, they have. In more recent years. Good morning. Right? Who else? France. Yes. Pardon my being able to spell. Where else? Turkey. Yes, ma'am. Oh, okay. Anywhere else? Let me write a couple more places for you. India. Anywhere else? If you think of a whole bunch of places, right? The list goes on, right? Now, places like the UK, for example, we've had the situation where the IRA, right? Which is the extremists who really felt that Ireland should be liberated completely from the UK. So, and part of history, you guys should know that Northern Ireland is under the control of the UK government. Southern Ireland isn't. And obviously, a lot of people say it's a war between religions, between the Catholic and the Protestants. Okay, that may be the case. Obviously, anybody who've ever schooled in the UK like I did had to experience the fact that you could get off a train and they're rushing you out of the station because there's a bomb threat in the station. Or you come into London, for example, and a bomb has exploded in a particular area. So they've had this for a while, right? But obviously, it wasn't until other countries like the US. Anybody remembers one of the most recent, well, one of the earlier cases where the US started to really think, okay, hold on, this stuff is serious.
First World War.
Pardon?
First World War.
Not quite what I'm looking for.
9/11.
9/11, but before 9/11, we had who?
Unabomber.
Pardon? We had Unabomber. Unabomber was actually after. Okay? Oklahoma, right? And then you also had, before 9/11, there was a threat. There wasn't a threat at the Olympics too. Actually, that was one where, anybody remembers where it was?
In Atlanta.
Atlanta, but before that, we had actual, where athletes were killed. Anybody remember where it was?
Germany, right?
Germany, yes. Munich. The Munich Games. And so you started to see an increase from a timeline from, let's say, around the 50s moving forward. Persons who seek to achieve their ideology by threatening the general public. That's technically what they're doing. And holding governments to ransom. Correct? So, 9/11, interestingly, created a lot more of a global focus, because you didn't just have persons who are from the U.S. getting killed in 9/11, right? Morning. Hi. You're supposed to be here?
No, is it AML?
It is.
I think to somebody.
Okay. Obviously not us. So, you start to see where other persons are being affected more than, the UK was trying to deal with their problems for years. Okay? So therefore, the world tried to say, okay, what can we do to stop them? How can terrorists function? Right? They can't function without finance, correct? So if you cut the finance, you cut them off, correct? And so that's when you start to see more and more legislation being being put in place to deal with terrorist financing and proliferation. Okay? Now, we're going to deal with the UN later, and when I talk about in Unit 7 on sanctions. But let's just start about most people in most jurisdictions now, thanks to the Financial Action Task Force and the OECD, have put in place some form of terrorist financing legislation through the form of an anti-terrorism act. And in most places, guess what it's called? Anti-terrorism act. Or countering the financing of terrorism, or countering terrorism. It's along that lines. Most of them follow a general pattern. How many of you know here when was our latest anti-terrorism act? Correct.
Who was that?
Yeah, in kindergarten. Okay. And my gentleman at the back, hold on, Ward,
I have him.
he got a couple candies coming to him. Okay, so you will find that the format for the legislation tends to follow around the same things because most people have to cover generally the same thing. You will also find that terrorist financing offenses have also become predicate offenses under the Money Laundering Act, correct? So under our act, the Anti-Terrorism Act will fall into what part of our Proceeds of Crime Act? Anybody knows? Schedule offense. Always remember the schedule offense. Where it isn't specifically mentioned in the legislation, it's going to be added to the schedule offenses. Remember what the schedule offenses are? That's where they bring in all the legislation that's going to apply to the act, right? Like the Gaming Act, for example, right? Like the Bribery Act. It all pulls under Section 1 of our Proceeds of Crime Act. You see how everything comes together, right? All right, so of course they go into all the different things that I was talking about in Unit 6 about the development of terrorist financing and why we start to see it. So governments are really trying to stop the flow. And how do most people deal, what currency are most people dealing with? Even the terrorists dealing in it. USD, right? So you will see prior to 9/11, the U.S. had introduced what we call the Patriot Act. And then they just added to the Patriot Act the powers. Now, at the time when the Patriot Act came into effect in the U.S., this is one of the major pieces of legislation that you see to thwart terrorism in the world, was the U.S. Patriot Act. A lot of people thought it was a little extreme. But obviously after 9/11 and they blow up 2 whole buildings, they realized, hold on, they couldn't have done this if they didn't have the financing. It's not cheap to be able to, pay for persons to travel into this jurisdiction to get the money to fund the actual bomb and other things that they're going to need, right? You got to train people. You can't just pick somebody up off the street and think that they can put together a bomb, right? They recruit. And so the U.S. realized that, hold on, whilst the CIA and FBI had databases where they kind of tracked terrorism, they didn't understand the full ambit of why they need to stop it at the financial level. Okay? And that's really how we came to the Patriot Act, which they go into detail about in here. The interesting part about the Patriot Act, because I'm going to jump ahead, let me tell you where I'm at, page 2, not page 2, 261, which is section 2. It talks about the U.S. Patriot Act and its extraterritorial reach. I'm jumping a little ahead because I just want to give you an idea how we get to terrorist financing and how the rest of us become watchdogs for it. Okay? So, the U.S. Patriot Act, whilst it had some teeth of dealing with financing, it was only after 9/11, and I actually think it tells you in here how many days after they actually amended it. I think it was a bare 7 weeks, they say. And that was true. I remember 9/11, and I remember the changes that the U.S. Patriot Act brought into effect. So you will see now that there is very little transactions in the world that aren't being scrutinized. How are they being scrutinized? Most people wire funds, don't they? And most of us know from correspondent banking that when you wire fund, everybody's being checked against some database, correct? And so if there's any kind of question, that transaction isn't going anywhere. So that's technically what they attempted to do. And to give law enforcement powers to investigate, seize, just go on hunches, because it's very difficult to infiltrate these kind of groups. Okay? And a lot of them are dealing in cash. Although they've become a little bit more sophisticated over the years. But they still deal in cash. Because guess what? If I realize that the authorities are close on my tail, I need to be able to grab my cash and go, right? Because I still need to be able to function. But there are other ways that you can stop them. And so you will find that from the wording in the first pages of the unit, they talk about terrorist financing offenses. Whilst it is extremely UK specific, it actually corresponds with our Anti-Terrorism Act. Why do I say that? The wording isn't exactly the same, but the intent is still there. Okay? And I say that particularly because the new Anti-Terrorism Act has come a long way from the original act that we had. Okay, and that's obviously because of the CFATF coming in and giving us a bad rating, correct? So, a lot of the offenses that you see there are reflected in our own Anti-Terrorism Act, right? So, they talk about some of the wording, and this is wording that you're going to find everywhere. Why is it going to be everywhere? Because with information sharing, so my man here at the FIU should know that when one government is trying to get information because they're investigating something and they want to be able to get information from another jurisdiction where they think the monies may be, for example, or that there may be the terrorists are actually housed. There are certain sharing powers that they can use to share information to help keep the rest of us safe. So when we jump on Bahamas there and decide to land in Florida, they're not about to blow up one of the airports there when we land in, correct? Okay. So I'm giving a little extremes, but hey, it's possible. All right? And so the wording is similar, and you'll see at 1.1, they talk about the offenses. And most of them are going to cover the offenses that the FATF outlines in its recommendation. So recommendation 5, for example, as you see there, can somebody read me recommendation 5 at 258? It's at the bottom of the page, depending on how you printed your stuff.
Countries should criminalize terrorist financing on the basis of the Terrorist Financing Convention and should criminalize not only the financing of terrorist acts, but also the financing of terrorist organizations and individual terrorists, even in the absence of a link to a specific terrorist act or acts. Countries should ensure that such offenses are designated as money laundering predicate offenses.
Correct. And so one of the things we've done is we've made it a predicate offense, correct? So, with that being said, can somebody read the interpreted note, somebody else? That's at the bottom, at 1.
Recommendation 5 was developed with the objective of ensuring that countries have a legal capacity to prosecute and apply criminal sanctions to persons that finance terrorism. Given the close connection between international terrorism and inter-area money laundering, another objective of Recommendation 5 is to emphasize this link by obligating countries to include terrorist financing offenses as predicate offenses for money laundering.
Right. So, basically, what do they want to stop? They want to stop you from assisting. So they want to stop the terrorists from carrying out the offense. They want to And that may be just through small little units. That might be one individual person, like we had the Unabomber. Or it could be through larger groups, like, give me some larger groups that everybody knows. Everybody knows these names now. Yes. Al Qaeda. They're now household names, correct? You also have the Tigers out of not Sierra Leone. What's the country? My brain going dead. It's near Pakistan. It'll come to me in a minute. My brain is going dead. But you have a lot of these extremists out there. All right? And so not only do you want to capture, one, the domestic terrorists, because that's what technically the Unabomber was, and our guy out of Oklahoma in the U.S. They were domestic terrorists, right? But then you have the international terrorists that create the 9/11, that blow up the hotel in Jakarta, right? We had the cafe bombings in France. We want to be able to stop those. You have the Lockerbie, right? Lockerbie came way before 9/11, right? Everybody knows what Lockerbie was, right? Yes, so Pan Am, I was actually supposed to be on that particular plane. I decided to take a train to London to change my flight, because I would have gotten home after Christmas. I think it was like Christmas. Tell me about it. I'm blessed and highly favored. You understand? But I had to actually travel to London from where I was and go to the Pan Am office there and change my flight. So when I got home, my aunt didn't know that I wasn't on the plane and called my mom in a panic. So that was a bad Christmas for a lot of people. But Pan Am's flight was supposed to actually go to New York. It actually, most transatlantic flights makes a kind of a arc when it flies. So it would have gone up over Scotland and come back down to New York. It's easier to fly that way. And unfortunately, it blew up when it was over Scotland, which is Lockerbie. All right? That was one of the first real instances where, there again, you had, one, planes being bombed. Two, persons from every walk of life is on that plane. All right? And it happened at a time when, this is Christmas. Nobody expect these kind of things to happen. All right? So, and we talk about TSA. I'm straying a little bit, but we talk about TSA. We all stressed out about going through TSA. Got to take off our shoes, take off our belts, all the rest of this. In the UK, TSA was in effect even before Lockerbie. Put it tightened up to what we have now when we go through our airport and other places. So for me, I just find it strange that everybody gets a little upset with TSA, because I've been traveling through the UK system for years, where they actually have had in place similar procedures to help protect us, correct? So things may be a little inconvenient, like terrorist financing, and the fact that if you're dealing in any way with products that can be used for terrorist financing, you also have to be part of the guard, in essence, that helps protect everybody else. So that being said, you have legislation that reflects across jurisdictional planes, correct? They're all going to say basically the same thing, all right? So they have down here, and they go into all of the sections that relate to the UK Act. So before we start going into sections, basically the effect is the same, and the purpose is we want to criminalize it. Because if you are fined, you're unlikely to really, most people don't really care if they hit in the pocket. But if you're going to face some criminal sanction, then you're more than likely going to adhere to it, correct? And then you're going to face other kind of sanctions, which we're going to go into later, but obviously correspond with this section, because to stop terrorist financing, the world may put sanctions in place against a particular country moving funds that we know them to be operating in, like Pakistan, like Iraq, right? And so you'll see where some of these, the next chapters, they kind of just merge into each other, because they all play They're all around the same theme, for example. All right? So, so we're trying to stop terrorists being able to carry out their acts. We're trying to stop the organizations, break them up, whether they're organizations or individuals, right? We talked about criminalizing. We want to do the same things that you see in the Proceeds of Crime Act throughout the world. We want to stop persons who help to help others by helping them to arrange to do what they need to do. Persons who assist them, same thing. Conceal, assist, attempt, arrange. Those words reflect in every legislation that you think of, right? That deals with money laundering, correct? And terrorism, anti-terrorism acts throughout the world are no different. They're going to have those same wording. And so that's because they're trying to achieve the same thing. The interesting thing about terrorist financing is they come from legitimate and illegitimate sources, correct? Now when I say legitimate, what do I mean by legitimate?
Money was not derived from the proceeds.
Yeah. All right. So, charities are one way that they use, and we're going on to that, how they use charities to fund. Most people who donate to charities think that the funds are going to be used for one thing, and in the end, they could be used for something else. Why? Because charities aren't really regulated. A lot of them. You have little charities popping up all over the place, correct? Mm-hmm. Some of the big ones we know, right? We know the World Health has certain charities that they help to bring food and cleaner water and stuff to countries in Africa, for example, or Southeast Asia, those kind of places. We have, everybody knows the Red Cross, correct? What's your name? Ramon. We have the Red Cross, right? Most of the bigger ones, you can actually, they're being audited, right? Most people here, again, you see other legislation being pulled into effect. So here in the Bahamas, if you are a nonprofit organization, you're required now to produce financials, correct? And you have to submit them to a regulatory authority. At least assure the regulatory authority in some way that you are actually, one, producing financials and they've been audited, correct? Because if you cannot track what these organizations are doing, how can you track where the funds are going, right? And that's why these things were being used. So nonprofit organizations are being used by the terrorists because they know that worldwide, nobody's going to be able to track the funds, right? Yes, some of the funds may be going for the purpose that it is intended to be used for, but the rest of the funds, they helping to set up their little camps and train people and buy the weapons, correct? Now you see how all this legislation pulls into effect, right? Okay. All right, something is happening here. Hold on a second. Trying to figure out. I hope these people can see this. I don't want to upgrade. Give me a second. Anyway, I'm hoping it goes away in a minute because I can't get to the screen to reduce it. Anyway, they should be able to still see me. Okay, so that being said, that's how we get everything else to pull into effect. All right? So basically, most of the legislation is going to be we're trying to get to the accomplices. We're trying to get to the people who are going to assist. We're not trying to put people in jail who innocently give money and don't know. Right? But we'd like to make them aware. And we'd like to be able to stop the funds, correct? We're not trying to lock up everybody, even though that's what it looks like. But we're not. So you'll see that FATF talks about, they have papers on everything. They have papers on terrorist financing, methodologies of how terrorists finance, topologies. They have, you'll have paper on just nonprofits, how they're being used. Now, am I saying you have to read through all of this stuff? I would scan and have an understanding of what they're, I'm not saying that you have to spend nights reading all this stuff. It's always good if you can. I'm the trainer in my organization for a lot of things. So obviously I unfortunately always have a very large reading file. So I'm always reading something. But it's good, you have to know what it is that we're trying to keep within the boundaries of when we're trying to stick within the parameters of the legislation, correct? And none of us go to jail. I always tell the people who I work with, I'm not going on the speeding bus. All right, it passes me every day. And I live off Yamacraw Road. I like to pass and wave. I don't plan to stop for any long period of time. I like my freedom. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I like my freedom. And I'm not going to jail for anybody. Okay? So, that being in mind, we have to look at the whole wider picture. And so, if you want to know why things happen, go and read the papers. They're all there. On the FATF site, I have a tag in my system that actually, hello. He's going to get mad at me, but you have to introduce yourself and say where you're from in terms of organization. Everybody else had to.
Valentino Bethel, self-employed at the moment in real estate development and property management.
I'm not picking on him because I know him, actually. I just want you to know I'm not picking on you. Everybody else had to do it.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, so we're on Unit 6. All right? So, one of the things I do, I have a bookmark in my Outlook. Not my Outlook, sorry, my internet for things like FATF. And I set it to give me notices when they post new things. That's become important to every one of you here, no matter what kind of job you're doing. I have one for the Egmont Group. My gentleman back there knows what the Egmont Group is, right? Tell me what the Egmont Group is. What is the Egmont Group?
Group of FIUs.
Yes. And they put out papers too. One of the ones that I used last year was the one that they put out on PEPs. Everybody knows PEPs, politically exposed persons. So it's always good to bookmark these things because they will tell you new things as they come out to help you be ahead of the game, because guess what? More than likely, as they put these things out, legislation will follow worldwide, not just in Bahamas, correct? The only thing is we may get written up before we do our legislation. Okay, that's my view, not my employer's view, and not Biff's view. But yeah, that's the reality. We tend to want to get nudged before we actually implement it and not try to stay ahead of the game and implement it before we get nudged, right? So, but that's just a tip for the trade. Always make sure that you bookmark those things and put it so that they will notify you when new things are posted. Because there's stuff all the time. All right? So, I don't know how much I want to go into the Patriot Act. The thing that you have to remember about the Patriot Act, it's the U.S. equivalent. All right? It gives a little bit more powers than our legislation does. But it's really Title III, the Patriot Act, that really has all the money laundering, kind of terrorist financing oomph, right? Some people would say it goes against the civil rights of individuals, but the world would say when you're dealing with terrorists, you have to be, maybe the civil rights of one person being abused, it kind of weighs out when you look at the millions that could be affected, all right? And so I would read it. I don't say you have to go back and read the Patriot Act. It's a boring act. I'm gonna let you. And it's just huge, okay? And to try and correspond you don't need all of that. You need to have a basic understanding. So, go through. I'm not here to teach you to page word for word for what this unit says, but go through it. If you have any questions, I'm here next class. Let me know. Unfortunately, I had to read through it because I had to train people on it. But you guys don't necessarily, but have an understanding what is it that it's there for. Okay? All right. just the things to remember. They actually have the significant points of it, so you don't have to read too much. At 262, it says perhaps the most significant aspects of the Patriot Act, both for non-U.S. institutions and persons. And you see what they have there. Can somebody read me those bullet points? Nobody volunteering.
U.S. banks must
Thank you.
take reasonable steps to identify the beneficial owners of accounts where these beneficial owners are foreign persons. U.S. banks must identify foreign persons whose funds move through payable or correspondent bank accounts held with them. U.S. banks must sever correspondent banking relationship with all shell banks. U.S. banks must apply enhanced due diligence for all foreign private banking customers and international correspondent accounts and correspondent relationships with offshore banks and banks in jurisdictions deemed to be non-cooperative in the international effort against money laundering. The long-arm jurisdiction of the U.S. courts is extended over any person or organization committing a money laundering offense involving a financial transaction that occurs in the U.S. The extraterritorial criminal jurisdiction of the U.S. is extended over any person outside the jurisdiction who engage in any act which, if it had been committed in the U.S., would constitute an offense.
Okay. So, one of the things I talked about initially when I talked about the Patriot Act is its extraterritorial reach, correct? So, we know from our own Proceeds of Crime Act, did you see these words? They're always things that repeat itself, right? So if it happened in the U.S., guess what? It's an offense, right? Even though it may not have technically happened in the U.S., it's happening in the U.S. because they're dealing in U.S. dollars. It's clearing through New York. New York clears everything to deal with U.S. dollars, right? And then we've seen the effect of this. We've seen correspondent banking relationships being canceled, right? Because they think, okay, hold on. We could see that y'all wasn't doing what you needed to do. Your policies weren't catching the very people that we know are dealing with terrorist financing. All right? And so we've seen our financial industry shrink because of correspondent banking relationships being canceled. We can't function without correspondent banking relationship. Why? Because you need another bank from this jurisdiction to be able to process the exchange of the currency and move it on to where it needs to go. And in most cases, we are dealing with USD. That's a sad part of the world, we're dealing with USD. But that's not to say that the European Union doesn't do the same thing, correct? So that being said, the extraterritorial reach of it, you will see breaking of corresponding banking relationships, closing of accounts, sanctions being put against countries, individuals, organizations. Correct? All right. So that's just to help you understand how the U.S., because everybody says, how does the U.S. do all of this stuff? How do they force me to do something and I am in a totally different sovereign jurisdiction? You want to deal with the U.S., right? So you want to deal with me, then you have to work with me because I put in place that these institutions can't do certain things unless they are sure about something. So therefore, you want the money to go through, then you're going to jump on board, right? Gotta love the U.S. All right. So that's basically, in essence, what you have to remember. And trust me, the Department of Justice is not in any way shy of prosecuting people. All right? You've seen from other areas that, I mean, look at, okay, I worked at Credit Suisse and UBS, and they've all received fines. You've seen where the CEO of UBS gets on a flight and lands in New York, and what happens? You got arrested getting off the plane, right? I always tell my boss, okay, I like to travel to the U.S. My brother and my nephews are in the U.S. I am not going to get taken away off the plane because I happen to land on U.S. soil and now I'm theirs because of what I do here. All right? So that's the extraterritorial reach. And obviously that that then brings on relationships that they create. So we saw things like TIAs, Tax and Information Exchange Agreements, right? We've seen other things, MLATs, Mutual Legal Assistance Treaties. I can get you to help me. We see the legislation that talks about helping law enforcement to be able to find where the monies are. So the job of the FIU, right? And the Ministry of Finance. Okay, so now you see how it all comes together, right? Everybody working for the same purpose. And everybody's affected. All right, that being said, so basically you just want to demonstrate an understanding of how the Patriot Act works. The U.S. under Section 319, the U.S. courts can seize assets that are held, particularly in USD and to a U.S. bank. Because let's face it, most countries aren't going to keep the monies in their own country, correct? They can put it somewhere else. And if you happen to have that money or in any way connected with the U.S. government, can force somebody else to give them their funds, they're going to seize it. And they seize it through Section 319, let me correct myself, 319 of the Patriot Act. All right? So, let me give you another example on how they do this. You'll notice that a lot of institutions, particularly in the offshore center, they don't have branches or subsidiaries in the U.S. Why? Because that same extraterritorial power is used to say, okay, well, you have a nice subsidiary here, or you have part of your funds here, I could deal with them and force you to give me what I want. You see how it works? That's what they're doing with that extraterritorial power. They will put things in place to seize the funds, to get an order from the court to get information from that subsidiary. So a lot of places, they try not for systems to be shared because the U.S. says, oh, okay, so if your subsidiary can access the database, then guess what? I can make sure I get a court order to get that information through your subsidiary. They got everything covered, trust me. All right? So that's how they deal with seizing funds and the forfeiture of it. That's why you'll see that a lot of the proceedings are actually brought out of New York. You don't see them being brought in Boston or places like that, right? You see them being brought by the Department of Justice out of the courts of New York. Because you're all clearing the U.S. money now. Okay, awesome. I just want to point something out. They talk about in rem. Does anybody know what in rem means? I know some of the lawyers can help me out here. In rem.
Really dealing with RAM, land issues.
Okay.
I'm sleeping today.
I see that. Obviously, you all need to stop and get a cup of coffee like I did. My coffee's going kind of cold, so I might need to heat this up soon. Anyone else in rem?
Does that not mean anywhere in the
The dictionary says made or availing against or affecting a thing, and therefore other people generally imposing a general liability.
Yes. So in rem. Land is one of those things that we speak about when we talk about in rem. But it's in there, and I kind of wondered, and does anybody know what in rem meant? It actually is mentioned in section 2.1, if I remember correctly, where they talk about a warrant of arrest in rem. So what really they're asking the court to do is if I can track anything to that one thing. So if I could tie something to the funds, then everything else falls within that. So I capture everything else. Do you see what I'm saying? It's just a Latin term that they use kind of loosely and causes everybody confusion. But that's really the intent of a warrant in rem. All right? They try to then, they attack one thing with the idea that anything else that you could draw the connection or inference to gets captured. Okay? Right. They have some additional powers there. We talk about the extraterritorial thing. So that can be both civil and criminal offenses that go with that. Because obviously, I mean, we, the little people, we get affected if a little bit of our money gets dealt with. For, like I said, some people that really doesn't make a difference. But civil penalties are still there, as well as criminal penalties. They give you some examples about the use of the extraterritorial powers. I kind of gave you an example where they seized funds that were actually held in a bank in the UK, in the U.S., or there was a subsidiary there, and they used the subsidiary to get the information that they wanted. So understand, always be able to draw inferences by giving examples, and they always have these little helpful the book thing, I don't know what they call that, there to help you to see which ones are the examples that you could always use to draw in, particularly when they give you those assignments and they want you to see, they want to test your understanding to see if you can give an example. So highlight those. There's always references at the bottom. I told one group, those references are not there just to be there. Most times they have more information than that's in the material. So I'm talking about the little footnotes at the bottom. Okay? They refer you to cases that could support the point that you're going to make in your assignment, for example. And they refer you to back to a particular module in your books that could help you. So don't ignore those things, please. I won't go into all of the examples, but obviously we've seen it where they've actually used the extraterritorial powers to get information. 9/11 was one of those where they realized, okay, Bahamas, I understand that they came through your jurisdiction to get into Florida to learn to fly. So I contact the necessary powers in the Bahamas and tell them I want you to go now and find out what you can find out in your jurisdiction to give to me. Correct? They realized that in 9/11, the amount of money needed to carry that out. All right, we ain't talking like a couple thousand. You understand? And when they actually finished the investigation into it, they realized how much money had to have moved from one place to another to fund it. So they needed to be able to go to these places so they could go back to the original source. Correct? That's really what they want to do. They want to go back to the original source. The EU obviously has similar processes in place. The EU in the fourth directive really tried to put in place a lot more of the FATF recommendations relating terrorism. The thing is that the fifth directive is about to come out. That should be effective at the end of this year. And it's going to deal with more things like terrorist financing proliferation. It's centered more on those things to be able to capture them. Okay? I think you may have already done some of the UN directives, have you? Not yet? It's coming. Warning. Okay? But the EU directive obviously is what all of the countries that are part of the EU must put into legislation. Okay, one of the most recent things that we saw that they did has no relation to what we're dealing with now, but will come up later on when you move on, has to do with their general procedures for data protection, which obviously has an effect on us too, because there again it's extraterritorial. Okay? So the EU does the same thing that the Patriot Act is doing. All right? And obviously they outline that in Unit 3. I'm not going to go through all of it. You need to read it. And they also would give, a lot of it is to really give the FIUs more powers or more ability to get information. One of the things coming out of even the most recent changes to our legislation is to allow the FIU to do certain things, right? So the FIU has more teeth, so that FIU can, in certain places like the UK, if the FIU is investigating something, they don't really have to charge somebody now to go in and ask you for the information and you have to provide it, which is interesting. Our legislation isn't fully there yet. You would have seen things like the unexplained wealth orders coming out of our Proceeds of Crime Act, which I'm interested to see how they apply here in the Bahamas. It's being used in the UK, and you've seen an increase in it in the UK over the last year and a half. And of course, you know, we kind of followed the UK. So it's going to be interesting to see exactly how the FIU with the police here, with the assistance of the police here, actually utilize unexplained wealth orders. Everybody knows what unexplained wealth orders are, right? I see a couple of people shaking their head and others don't. So under the Proceeds of Crime Act 2018, it came out in June of last year, which revamped our Proceeds of Crime Act. It gives a lot more powers to the investigative bodies like the police and the FIU to actually seize information and assets, for example, that they think would derive from proceeds of crime. So the unexplained wealth orders, obviously, if you are a sanitation worker and somehow you become a millionaire, you didn't win the lottery, and nobody in your family died to give you a large inheritance, that's called unexplained wealth. And through those orders, the authorities can therefore seize that wealth. And my understanding is they can actually seize it even if they don't charge you. The onus is then on you to prove that it's not unexplained wealth in order to get it back. And there's a whole process to allow for you to seek to get it back. Pardon? Well, you know, it's.
I do understand.
Let me put it like this. They, you know, if your laptop is black, and for all intents and purposes it's black, and you're trying to say it's blue, then we have a problem, right?
I understand.
Okay.
Saying it, you prove it.
Well, you know, what's happened now is that we realize that in order to fight the bad people out there, who are usually a step ahead of everybody else, unfortunately, some of your rights might unfortunately have to be abused in order for the greater good. And that's not to say that there's not in place procedures for you to get your wealth or whatever it is back. You just have to prove it. Now, prove to me, I know that you are a sanitation worker. For a sanitation worker, we can kind of guess what your salary is even without going to NIB, correct?
It's true.
All right. So, if you have not won the lottery or hit it big at Sabas's place, and nobody gave you a large inheritance, and you can't prove it, that's called unexplained wealth. How did you acquire that wealth? Clearly you must have gotten that wealth from some other means that you're not trying to put out there. Yeah, explain, right?
That addition to POCA 2018, was that inspired by the UK or the US?
The UK.
By the UK.
We kind of copied the UK legislation.
Okay.
And obviously, you'll see more of it coming into effect. You'll see Singapore and other places are obviously following suit because, you know, places like OECD and FATF are putting pressure on all of us.
Yeah.
We're trying to get off the bad list, all right? Our last CFATF evaluation really was the fact that regulatory oversight was not that institutions and other non-designated professionals and businesses didn't have compliance procedures in place. They just felt that the regulators weren't properly creating the oversight that was needed, right? To make sure that everybody's following and keeping in line. And the problem with us is we think about these things in kind of a box. And we have to look at the larger picture that these FATF looks at. When it evaluates the Bahamas, it looks at the Bahamas as a whole. So it isn't looking at just the financial services industry. It's looking at everything. So how can customs man the points of entry? We know that we truly do not have the manpower to man the points of entry that you can come into the Bahamas. We all know that people come into the Bahamas, they go on their boats to Florida, and they buy whatever they want, and they come in and they pull up to their own dock. Now, how customs know you pull up to your dock and you unload with all those nice things that you bought from Florida? They don't. We just don't have the resources to be able to effectively man those type of things. And so you have to look at all industries. It's all industries that's looked at. It isn't just the financial services industry. So my young lady here, what industry did you say you in?
Marv's Auto Center.
Okay, so she's in an auto center. We know that the movement of cars is one of the ways that you can use to those type of businesses launder money, correct? So you see how they look at the bigger picture. So when we look at how we got evaluated, they're not looking at just the financial services sector, which includes the accountants, the professional, the attorneys, the real estate agents. They're looking at everything in the Bahamas. And that's where we get the bad rating from, not necessarily from the financial services sector, who's got probably more things in place than other industries would have. And so that's where you see things like, okay, the other day we saw where the guys got arrested for the shady car deals, right? You'll see the legislation capturing them, for example, because it's easy to use cash-intensive businesses to launder funds. And obviously fraud is obviously rampant, so you give me your money and I don't have to produce the goods, which is what happened in those, I think the gentlemen that got arrested. They took the money and didn't produce the cars, right? Yes.
This lady with an orthodontist.
Yes.
Braces are expensive.
They are
buy
expensive.
one, they tell you to pay
They should know that was
$500
they
for
should have known that
braces.
was
Hello, I
right.
would have had them already.
Okay, so there, you see how these industries can be used, all right? And so that's the whole purpose of all this legislation. You see how everything comes into, everything is circular and can stem out to see how the circle falls into the nucleus in the middle, right? Okay, so that being said, they give you a lot of examples. They talk about how they were able to trace the funds from the French attacks and other things like that. I'm not going to go into them. Just be mindful of the fact that read through them, understand them. You know, you all have Google. Everything's on Google. If they mention stuff in these books and you can't find it, Google it. It'll come up. Trust me. All right? Understand the examples that they're giving you to tie into the actual substance that they're trying to teach you. If you can't tie it in, then that's where it becomes muddy. Okay? All right. We got a lot of time we're going through, so I have to go through this kind of quickly, people. All right. So, we see they focus on the UK because ICA is a UK-based organization that produces the diploma, correct? So therefore, it's very UK intensive. But that works for us because most of our legislation is being based on the UK. All right? So one of the things they talk about here is the UK looking at how it can deal with financing. Remember now, in the UK, they have MI5 and MI6. Anybody knows who deals with what? No? Quiet? They have a very nice building in London. Can't miss it when you go downtown. Yes. See, this thing looks like it's been through the motion. Yes. Sorry, somebody was starting to say something else?
Secret Service is in my system.
Okay, yes. One of them deals with domestic matters, and the other one are domestic terrorism and similar matters, and the other one deals with
Trends.
internationally. Do you know which one deals with what?
MI6, threats.
Yes. MI5 is dealing with the domestic. All right? And yet they have lovely building. Most people, anybody watch, I'm straying, watches the James Bond? Okay. They showed the building in, I think, the last two versions of it. I think they even blew it up. It's still there, it's not blown up. But they built a new building over the last years. But obviously, the U.S., through its what they call contest strategy, in seeking to counter terrorism, looked at how they pursue by stopping the attacks, prevent, to stop people from becoming terrorists or supporting violent extremists, protect, to strengthen the UK protection against terrorist attacks, and prepare where an attack cannot be stopped to mitigate its impact. One of the things you can do on, I'm trying to remember which one it is now, hold on. I made a note so I can't forget. And I should know this because I tell my team all the time to check it. Hold on a second. Of course, because I want to find it, I can't find it. Anyway, you can always find out what the level of threat is to the UK. You can go on the websites, and it will tell you what level of threat as a nation they consider the UK in terms of terrorist threats. Obviously, MI5 threat to MI6 is going to be different because MI5 is dealing with the domestic threat. And you know, in the UK, they got all kind of crazy people. You got the Islamic extremists, you got the IRA, you know, everybody trying to prove something. And obviously they target the big cities, like London, Birmingham, Manchester, those kind of places. Dublin, Belfast always getting blown up. I mean, it's obviously quiet down over the years because the UK government has come into some relations with the IRA to kind of calm down and come to a better understanding how they could deal with policies, stop them keep blowing up the place. All right, one Christmas, I don't know if you guys remember, the whole financial district in the UK was bombed. So it's to stop things like that. But they obviously create levels, and a lot of places now create a level. The US have a level of terrorist threat against them, and you can usually find that out too. Google, thank God. US Treasury site has all sorts of information. I also bookmarked that because OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which is the unit out of the US that puts up the sanctions list and designates all the people that you should not be doing business with. I have a warning to put me on notice of when they update that. And trust me, they update it on a regular basis. I mean, now it's almost weekly. But they also have a site there when we go into sanctions, but I'm jumping ahead. But they have a site there that you can actually go onto and put names in and search to see if they're on the list. It's free. Yay. Okay? Most times you don't have to do it. I do it anyway. But bear in mind that SWIFT, which is the wiring service that everybody uses, it's out of Belgium, uses OFAC listing to scan names that going through the wire system. Okay? So, that being said, they go into how the UK strategy and how it's trying to deal with terrorist financing. Whilst I will tell you to understand it, you don't have to know it like in depth, but understand it here because I'm sure your assignment will be based on it. Right? So, one of the things you have to remember that in the UK, they last updated their strategy towards financing was in June of last year. And really, they set out for you the strategic aims at page 268 and 269. So obviously it's they're trying to get ahead of the game, so they're trying to stop. It's always great if they could stop the attack before it happened. So the intelligence-based information. My gentleman here at the FIU would know that, through Interpol and other organizations, the U.S. has always had a kind of database on terrorists or people that they think need to be watched closely. And obviously over the years, that database, particularly since 9/11, has expanded. And they try to put as much information in there and share that with other law enforcement agencies like Interpol. And the UK and the US actually entered an agreement whereby they use the tracking system, which is, they can utilize the database that the US have of all of these names and all that information. They talk about it in there. Go and do the research. I want you guys to tell me what you find on Google. I know you're going to find the information. Actually, if you go in, it's going to take you to the Treasury site and have some nice PDF documents. They'll summarize for you better than this unit does on that whole system. Okay? All right. So, in the UK, they have various agencies that are put in place to help to put together this, in essence, to implement a strategy of contest. And so you'll see you have HM Treasury, which is Her Majesty's Treasury, central government, the Office of Security and Counter-Terrorism, and the Joint Terrorism Analysis Center. All of them work together to help to fight with MI5 and MI6. A lot of them actually are either part of MI6 or even if they're outside within the police department, all the information comes together. So they talk about them. They go into them in great detail. So you'll see where they give you some summaries of what the Treasury Department in the UK does. It also talks about the role of central government. Central government equivalent would be like our local government, even though we're in there yet, but technically it's a lot more involved with day-to-day operations of the country as opposed to our local government that's set up in the different islands. It tells you about the Office of Security and Counterterrorism. That's the office that advises the minister responsible for the development of policies and measures to help counterterrorism, which includes proliferation. Boring stuff, I know. They go into the Joint Terrorism Analysis Center. That's the one that actually creates the levels that they put the country at different stages. And they have 5 levels that they deal with. Obviously, low is an attack, is the lowest that you can put the country at. I haven't ever seen the UK at low. I can let you know that now. And so that is, an attack is unlikely. It never happens. Moderate would be an attack is possible but not likely. Substantial is an attack is strong but possible. Severe is an attack is highly likely. And critical is an attack expectant or imminent. Currently, my understanding is that it's currently the threat level is at substantial in the UK. It's the MI5 website that you can figure that out. The UK has a similar level. I think they do theirs in color code as opposed to the naming. They go from, I think it's green to red, and they have orange and yellow and all kind of things in the middle there. We've had a few of those colors where you would see heightened security, happening. We saw it when we had the Times Square bombings, where the whole country's color, I think it went to orange, and slightly between orange and red. And so that tells you of the security concerns that the nation has. And, you know, as people traveling, TSA will then tell you you can't bring nothing through. All right? So, what they realize with with the threat of terrorism to nations, most countries have put into effect some kind of level of terrorist concern. We do have one in the Bahamas. Some of us would have seen, if you work downtown, they don't do it as often as they should, but you'll see when they do testing to see how our emergency response is to certain things. You'll see the emergency services vehicles and the police and other things doing exercises downtown. It doesn't happen often, but obviously, I think they have a cycle in which they do them. They try not to disrupt too much of the ongoing events that are happening on a day-to-day basis in the city, but unfortunately, it needs to happen. I mean, it is a possibility that they could use the Bahamas. It's just, we just become collateral damage at that stage, or means to an end, so to speak. But, yeah. So, that being said, they talk about the sections in the UK Act. Specifically, the offenses that deal with terrorism are sections 15 to 18. I will let you know that they kind of reflect ours, like I said earlier. And I would suggest you look at sections 14 through 17 of our legislation. They may not have the same wording, but basically you'll see that they do the same thing. I'm not going to go into all of them because I kind of already spoke about, you know, they're doing the same things. If you're, you enter into arrangement, if you help persons to move the money, to buy things, and it seems draconian, but we can understand the reason why it is the way it is. Terrorism, they do define terrorism in our act. They define terrorist property. Look it up. It's always good to see what they define as terrorist property. Terrorist threat, remember, can be anything from where it endangers life to serious damage to property. That's really what it's attempting to cover. Okay? And this stuff will put you to sleep. So try to read it when you're awake. Pardon? So the provisions of the UK Counter Terrorism Act is the ones that really require you to do is the act that really requires you to do the due diligence. All right? You need to understand how your products and services that you utilize in your industry can be used by terrorists and money launderers generally to facilitate their means of moving the money, laundering the money, moving it. Notice why I said sometimes it isn't even illegitimate money. It could be quite legitimate money that's being used, but you need to understand how the money is being flowed and what it's being used for. And so the Counterterrorism Act in the UK is the one that sets down what is needed in terms of customer due diligence and monitoring by institutions to understand where the flow of money, if you moving the flow of money through you. I mean, people buy real property. Real property can be flipped easily, right? That's a cash, easy to move cash to pay for a piece of real property and then sell it in a short order of time. Your money's clean, right? This is why attorneys' accounts, their client accounts are came under scrutiny, right? Because quite often they would give the attorneys cash, and the attorneys put the cash in their client account. It's now in the financial system. Brown, clean. Right? Terrorists use the same methods. All right. One of the things I want to talk about with terrorism, I'm not going to go into all of these things where into detail like they have, but obviously they talk about the characteristics and source of financing. We talked about this already. They want to recruit, they want to train, they want to buy, they want travel. And they use a lot of ways to deal with these type of things. One of the things I want you guys to understand is how they move monies. So they don't have to necessarily move money through what you deem to be traditional sources. We know things like hawalas. Everybody knows what a hawala is? Everybody shaking their head, but nobody seems to. I don't see that light going on. What's a hawala? No idea?
Underground banking.
Underground banking. So hawalas were developed in countries like China and India years ago before you had banking systems. And so it's a kind of trust basis where I go into the hawala operative and I place my funds with them, and I want that fund to go to my relative in Indonesia. Right? It's not going to go to any banking system that I know, but I communicate to my family in Indonesia, this is where you need to go, and this is whatever code or whatever you have to produce, and they'll give you the money.
Cash doesn't move.
Cash moves, but it doesn't move in the way that you're thinking about it.
It doesn't go to the.
So it's not being wired or any of that kind of stuff. Okay? And so my friend goes into the hawala raw operative. It could be a little mom and pop store. It looks like a little convenience store, but the hawala is being operated out of there. And they give my family who don't know too much about banking systems. They don't have those kind of the sophisticated banking systems that we do, and they're able to get funds. I mean, we do it here through the gaming houses, right? Even though technically we're not supposed to do it. You understand? And particularly since RBC and the rest of these places closed down the branches, right? You'll see that these kind of non-traditional banking financial systems are being used in order to get money to different places. And so terrorists, like everybody else, know that they could utilize these systems because you can't really track that money. It isn't like I have a piece of paper that shows that this is moving from A to B, you know? And a lot of times that's what the terrorists use. Because they're in places like Pakistan and Iraq. They have banks, but obviously because of the sanctions that's being put in place, the funds can't be moved to the traditional financial system. So they use the hawalas. Or
Bitcoin as well.
Bitcoin. Yeah, Bitcoin is coming under greater scrutiny because, there's no tracking system. We already know that it's not tied to any central bank or specific currency. Nobody was really doing due diligence. Other ways of doing it, is prepaid credit cards. I put a whole bunch of money on it. I ship it off to my family member or my terrorist colleague. And wow, they have funds, right? They can go in and swipe. Nobody asks any questions. They can't even trace it back to the person because it doesn't have a name on it attached to it. Correct? And when they first came out, nobody was doing any kind of due diligence on it. And those can be reloaded, a lot of them. Who was tracking it? So they used as much of so technically what I'm trying to say is the same things that are used in what we think of traditional money laundering are being used. And remember that terrorists will use all kind of ways to get what they need. They'll use extortion. They use kidnapping. They'll deal in drugs. They'll steal. They'll use legitimate sources like businesses and to move the money. Even the UN wasn't aware that they were being used. Their charities were being used to move terrorist funds and weapons to these places where the terrorists are known. The UN, for example, it was in Afghanistan. They're there thinking they're giving humanitarian aid, not knowing that under their food stuff was the weapons and the cash to finance the terrorists there. And remember what I said, these aren't the things that are being audited. And a lot of times you don't have anybody looking to see, is the money really being used? Or it may be being used, but not all of it is being used in the country for what it's intended to be used for. Terrorists are funded through, some governments fund terrorists, right? And this is why we have that sanctions regime, because we realize that some of these terrorist groups are being financed by governments. All right? We know that Gaddafi was helping to finance terrorist groups. All right? So that's why we try to get at the government money too. So remember, they try to set you up and helping you to understand the different ways that they use to exploit as much of the products and services out there to their advantage. One of the things we saw when you see these extremists take over nations, they're using the mineral resources, aren't they? If it's rich in gas and oil, fine, we use the money from that. We can sell it to you, Mr. US, and we use it to fund our terrorist activity. All right? Artifacts. You find that when you have these terrorist groups taking over countries, they use the artifacts from the countries. They sell them off. They don't really care. You know, they want the money. So there's lots of ways in which they can fund. And so you can see how difficult it is to be able to track. Want to give me another means by which you saw it, certain types of products coming under greater scrutiny by the international community, because these things are easily carried. This particular things I could put in my pocket and walk to TSA. Anybody have an idea what it could be? Okay, everybody look low. No, precious metals, minerals. So diamonds, right? Diamonds are an easy way. You use the diamonds, and a lot of these countries, like places in Africa where you can get the diamonds, the rebels take over. They use the precious stone, and they sell it abroad. They got cash now. That's an easy way to move it. So I'm not actually selling it from the home country where I know the authorities are looking for it. I'm actually transporting it now to, say, somewhere in Europe. You know, a lot of the big diamond houses that will cut and set these kind of stones are in Europe. I take it to that country and I sell it there to one of the dealers there. I now have cash. It's raw. It's a raw diamond. How you could track where I got it? So now then you see these kind of agencies have to now do their own due diligence. They gotta say who brought it in, where did they say it came from, and particularly if they're not getting it from a known source that is producing these kind of things. All right. It's amazing how they find a way. They're always thinking, bear that in mind. So that's clearly a legitimate way to finance terrorism, correct? So they speak about all these things in here. So one of the other ways that they deal with terrorism financing is to send out advisories, correct? So that's why it's important to bookmark things, because advisories come out. You'll see FIU, maybe not the FIU so much as now our global regulatory body for the financial services sector, which is now the Securities Commission, the Central Bank, and the Insurance Commission, which includes the Compliance Commission, right? They are now working together to produce guidelines and put out notices so everybody is being notified of the same thing and being required to do the same due diligence or put the same policies and procedures in place. The most recent guidelines that was issued, you'd see that you have the crest of all of those regulators on the front, correct? And then when you go on their site, they refer you to the one that the central bank puts out, because that's the one that they're all putting out now. Okay? You'll see things, advisories. So one of the ones we had recently was the travel advisory that you always see. It was on the news yesterday where the reporters were talking to the Royal Caribbean Cruise Line because the U.S. put a travel advisory on the Bahamas. All right? So this is where now we see the use of sanctions coming into effect to help with this whole fight against terrorism. All right? And so that's why some of this unit, they prepare you for the next one, because they're telling you that we use things like embargoes and other forms of sanctions to advisories to help in this fight. All right? So, some of us in the financial services industry, we get this lovely little book. Came out. So what is it? You gotta read through 1 trillion names in here. You don't have to read through it because it's all available electronically. You have to search it to make sure none of your clients are one of these Abduls, Mohammeds, Sheikh Ali, for example. You know? What is it? This is where they take the UN sanctions and they put it into our legislation. So, some of us quite recently in the financial services industry had to provide a certificate to the Securities Commission to say that the Iraq and the Afghan orders, that we didn't have any of the persons on those lists. And that if we did have any of them, we will notify the regulatory body or authorities on an urgent basis, correct? Central Bank did it first, but there was a lot more of a no response. If you didn't have anything, you didn't have to respond. But what happened is, what they've done in the legislation now is they actually require you on an annual basis, financial institutions. And notice I'm using the word financial institution broadly, because it includes the attorneys, accountants, real estate agents, have to send us an annual certificate to say that they're keeping abreast of all the UN sanctions that are out there and lists. And you're checking against it and you don't have any clients. And if you did have any clients, you reported them. So now they put it into law. Joy. That's one more thing to add to my list. So you could always find, if you cannot find it on the site, remember now, the UN sanctions are always on its site. Now whether you could find is another thing, because they have numbers, which I think is, just put a name beside it, please. Don't give me the number, because I don't remember the number. But anyway, they usually put as a number. Resolution 3195, for example. What the heck does that mean? But that's really what it is. So that's another one of those sites that I put to send me advisors of when they update. Okay? So then you have, so a lot of these countries will either have domestic lists, or you'll have the international organization setting up the listing. So, this is where I'm merging the units. So, sanctions. Why do we put sanctions in place? Sanctions can be targeted specifically at some specific person or individual organization, or they're going to be placed on a country, for example. And so let's deal with the domestic ones first. So we already spoke about one of them, the one OFAC. So the Office of Financial Asset Control in the U.S., which is a unit or department of the U.S. Treasury Department, puts out listings. And that listing sometimes is referred to as designated persons, right? And that listing comes out on a regular basis. One of the one of the older ones that we know about, where they put a sanction and they have a whole country listed, was Cuba, right? Now Cuba, they've relaxed the sanction slightly. Bear that in mind. They haven't taken it away fully from the OFAC list. All right? And bear in mind that sanctions can also be targeted to industries. Because remember now, industries can be the ones that help to produce the mechanisms to create the weapon of mass destruction. Particularly now that we move in the technological age, and we want to be able to be somewhere else when we decide to set off the bomb, correct? Or decide to push the button that sends how many nukes in the air. Technology allows us to do that. So it could also be against industries. So let's talk about Cuba. So that was a domestic designation that unfortunately put the rest of us in a position that we have to comply with it because we're dealing in U.S. dollars. If you're dealing in U.S. dollars, you don't even want to show in the past that that money came through Cuba because the U.S. will stop you in your tracks. Next thing you know, you on the list too. All right? And they have no qualms about putting persons who are linked to it, to the person or the organization. So, for example, if they put it against a government, they will put it against the people who are connected to that individual in the government, correct? That includes not only family members, friends, and acquaintances, but it's also going to include their companies that they may have or they may be involved with. And so, in a sense, sanctions have a wider reach than sometimes they appear to be. That's one of the things to remember.
Saw that Havana is on.
Yes. Because obviously people pay a lot in cash. And even though they have put certain things in place to relax the U.S. Blocking of moving cash, doing trade, going to the to Cuba, sorry. They've relaxed it in such a way that U.S. businesses have been able to invest, but you can't do it unless you're licensed or authorized to do it from the U.S. Treasury. Okay? Because they want to be able to monitor the movement of your funds and your investments and what you're getting back from Cuba. And so they've relaxed it to some extent. Okay? So domestic sanctions, domestic listings. OFAC, like I said, everybody who's using SWIFT, trust me, their name going through the OFAC. When you put it through SWIFT, that name is going through OFAC. You don't have to worry about it. It's going to go to them. That's just a given. All right? And so when they tell you, do you think you could provide more information on this client or the beneficiary? More than likely, the correspondent bank, it came up in SWIFT as a warning. And that fund is not going any further unless you could show that this is a legitimate source. And this isn't the person who they think it is. Correct? All right. So, that being said, the EU puts out a similar list. One of the things to understand is what is it that the UN's listing does. Now, to understand the UN, you need to understand why was the UN established. The UN was established after the Second World War. It replaced an ineffective body that was called the League of Nations, where countries came together and they were trying to really stop people like Hitler, and clearly it was totally ineffective because he was able to take over half the world, if not most of the world, correct? And the idea is to, one, create international peace and tranquility. Other reasons why we do it, where you have communist governments and these extremist governments or coming into play, and you want to get back to a democratic society. That's to force people to get back to a democratic society. Or they're doing something that we think is just abhorrent to the general moral standard of the world. So, apartheid. You saw South Africa, the UN put sanctions on South Africa. They put sanctions against Rwanda Everybody knows where Rwanda is, right? African country where you had a particular rebel force taking over the government and creating genocide. We saw it again in places like Yugoslavia. We saw it in Iraq. They tried to get rid of a whole group of people, correct? They were no different than Hitler. Hitler was trying to get rid of the Jews. Well, you know, sometime or the other, somebody else is going to be targeted. Unfortunately, it's a bad part of our human nature in life. As humans, we tend to set groupings and then create hatreds towards those groupings, which might be justified or not. But you see you see the country trying to wipe out a whole group of people, right? We saw how they were used in South Africa. So let's get back to why the UN was set up and how it functions. So the UN was set up after the World War to be a more effective means of trying to help police the world. All right? We first saw the UN through its criminal tribunals, where it was actually trying leaders of countries for war crimes. So we first saw it with the Nazis being tried. Then we saw it, I think it was the Yugoslavian president or whoever he was. But he was tried. We see it where the UN goes in and monitors countries for development of weapons of mass destruction. We have countries that most of the G20 countries are signatories or members of the UN. And so when the UN came into effect, they realized that they had to give the UN teeth. The problem with the League of Nations, which was its predecessor, is it couldn't do anything. They couldn't stop Hitler from doing anything. What does that mean by that? What I mean by that? So what they did, the UN Charter sets up the ability for the UN to enforce, to technically have a power to stop you economically or through other means in order to get you to come back in line with how the rest of the world thinks that you should operate. All right? So technically, the UN, first you would see them not against individuals, you'll see them do it against countries. That's why you have the Iraq order, you have the Afghanistan order, there's a whole bunch of them. All right? And you'll see that where they're putting them in place and they're targeting specific countries as opposed to individuals, right? And what they're trying to do, they're trying to stop you economically. So if I stop you, there again goes to the money. If I can stop you through finance, I can get you to agree to certain things, correct? Obviously it works sometimes, it don't always work. You gotta have the rest of the international community behind you. All right? Now the UN does have a police force, but it isn't kind of the police force that, could go in and say, we're taking over your country, by the way. But all the countries donate soldiers and everything to the UN policing system. And they are able to go in certain situations. And that's where you'll see that the UN then gets other countries to come in. So when we had the war against Iraq, you saw where France and the UK and the US and all these other countries, Australia, are lending their might to help to enforce certain things, right? In that case, it was said that Saddam Hussein, not only was he committing genocide, but he was using the funds to create weapons of mass destruction to blow up the whole world. Of course, they went in and they didn't really find any weapons of mass destruction, but we do have evidence that he really was committing genocide. Likewise, you'll see that they did the same thing in Russia. When we saw the Russian government fall apart, and we saw these little countries popping up as a result, and you have people like Putin coming into power, you realize then that in order to stop them putting a threat to the rest of the world, there's sanctions that needs to be put in place. Now those sanctions, like I said, can either be targeted specifically at the nation itself to stop the economic flow of money because most governments have an account somewhere, and somewhere it's going to be in US dollars. Most governments, I don't know a government in the world that doesn't have a US dollar account. So the US has power to help with that. We know that the UN sits in New York. That wasn't by accident, to be honest. But obviously, when we set up the UN, we gave it a charter where we got members to sign on to say, look, we're giving it teeth. And we're going to say that if we sign on to these UN treaties and other things, we're going to incorporate whatever the UN Security Council's put into place in our laws. So that's why you see we have the Iraq and Iran order being put into legislation in the Bahamas. Because we agreed that if they do certain things, we're going to implement it in our jurisdiction, and it will become law. Okay? So that's how we got the teeth behind the UN. A lot of people say the UN still isn't as effective as it needs to be as a policing body, as an overseeing body, but hey, it's better than nothing, right? And so now then, we could look at how we could do targets. One of the things that UN realized is if you, one of the effects of their sanctions is they stop the whole flow of monies into the country, but what happens? It then has a humanitarian impact, right? So let's look at Somalia, for example. They realized they put the sanction against Somalia, so you have the Somalia order, by the way. They stopped all of the economic flow, that's goods and services too. It isn't just cash, it's goods and services. It's anything that will, the country can earn funds. So now it comes to a standstill. So where these people can get food from? Then you have starving, mass starving. That's what happened. So what they now realize is when they do these kind of comprehensive sanctions like that, they may have to target it. So that you don't have this, you don't end up with people starving to death who are quite innocent of what's happening. All right? So you can have things that are targeted. They're at specific persons. So let's use Brazil. You will see that the OFAC has put on their sanctions list persons who are connected with the present government of Brazil and the government corporations. And you're seeing that there are riots and stuff happening in different countries in South America. So it isn't just Brazil that they did it for. And you see that people are starving, and then you see rioting, right? Because there's no funds going in. They have listings against, the OFAC has listings against Honduras. Now you see why all the people trying to get across the border, they take a long trek. They have come to how many countries to try and get to the US border? So sanctions can be targeted at specific individuals. They can be done against specific industries. So most of the ones that deal, the UN's sanctions, not only do they deal with people, but they deal with industries. So for example, there's one against Iran. It doesn't say that you can't do business with Iran, persons in Iran. It says that if you do business with them, you have a duty, for example, to make sure that you understand what they're doing, and if they're involved in certain industries, you need to make sure that those industries aren't going to be used to help them to finance terrorism or create weapons of mass destruction, for example. Why do I say that? Let's look at the examples that have happened. So you have dual purpose goods. So a little chip that can finance your little laptop here can also be used to blow up the bomb. So I need to be able, if you're saying that you have a computer company in Iraq, and I'm opening up an account for John Blow, who owns the computer company, and I know that a large portion of their business is in Iraq, I need to make sure that that industry isn't one that can help to create the weapon of mass destruction. But also, if it can, let's look at the flow of that money. Because you'll see them buying more of something than the other, correct? So, therefore, it could be targeted industries and technology, because these are the things that can be used. you need uranium, for example. Certain chemicals are going to be used to create weapons of mass destruction, to create bombs. Like I said, we look at the diamond industry. That has had to, the whole precious stone industry has had to be looked at because it's easy to transport. I mean, I remember they had stopped I think they were coming out of, I think it was Uganda, no, Zimbabwe. They had bags of diamonds. And here it is, they have civil unrest. What do you think that could be used for? All right, this is how they apply the sanctions. All right, and this is how we have to be careful when we set up our policies and how we're monitoring this and how we could be used inadvertently. Charities, for example, we've realized that, you know, people like to give. We hope to help others. But in giving, you need to understand what you're giving to. So there's things like Charity Navigator that's been set up. The U.S. Has set up this website called Charity Navigator that you can go on to and see if the charity is legitimate. All right, because it's obviously being monitored or at least regulated to make sure that if it's funding medical aid, like Doctors Without Borders, that's where the doctors go in and they try to help, particularly kids. There are a lot of kids being born with what they call cleft palates. So these are the doctors who give freely of their time to go to these countries and perform the surgeries needed to help these kids. And a lot of that is being born because the mother isn't getting the nutritional development, and it's causing development in the womb problems, and the child comes out with a cleft palate. And so it's then difficult then for the child to eat and drink because they have a lip that didn't close properly and the palate didn't develop the way it should. And these doctors go in and they do plastic surgery and put it back to the way it should and fix their teeth and the palate, create the correct curvature in the mouth and all these things. And they give of their time freely. So they have been used inadvertently by terrorists. But because they're monitored, they were better able to understand when in which countries they were being used like that. And you'll see Doctors Without Borders they go to places like India. India has a lot of kids that are being born with cleft palates. This is a legitimate charity where doctors are doing good work, but unfortunately, they can be used. And everybody can be used. But it at least gives you a basis where you could go in and search to see if the charity is a legitimate charity. And it isn't just in the U.S. They actually have it done in countries too. It isn't as wide in terms of the charities that are in the U.S. in terms of the listing. But there's some there that you can look at. And some of these are actually required in their jurisdiction. Some charities, for example, are required to be registered. Okay? And so that helps because then they have to do audited financials, for example. You could track the funds. And so if you happen to be the director, you're a financial corporate service provider or a trustee, and the beneficiaries would like to donate monies, or the settler has said, on my death, you have to donate $20 million to whatever charity. You can go in and do some due diligence to make sure this is a legitimate charity, and the corresponding bank tells you, well, I'm not sending money there, and you need to explain to me why you're sending money there to start with. And if you get too many of those hits, then they start doing business with you, right? So, see how it all comes together? It's the joys. Actually, in here, I thought it was interesting. At 279, they actually gave you some figures as to the cost of doing some of these terrorist activities. They talk about the Jakarta bombing. I had 30,000 US dollars. They actually tell you in here how much it actually cost to do 9/11. That was a staggering figure. We're talking millions here. Can you imagine? Millions of dollars was moved through financial system to just get them to the stage where they could get on these planes and divert these planes. And nobody knew that the money was being moved. Nowadays, we hope somebody's going to pick it up somewhere. Because that U.S. database, it's the tracking system, will take all that information and they get information from other FIUs and investigative bodies like Interpol and other places like that. And they put all that stuff in their tracking system. And the great thing is, we're hoping that we're a little safer. I don't know if we are, but they're just like the money launderers. They're trying to outrun the system. So bear that in mind. Okay, where are we? They go into details about charities. And they talk about how monies get to charities. So we're talking about, we already talked about how we could check to see if they're legitimate charities, about certain things that we put in place to make sure we could somehow understand the money flow into charities. One of the things they talk about is zakata. So, you know, it's similar to like what we call as tithes. We give so much to the church. Under the Islamic faith, they have this kind of, under the principles of Islam, among some of the other crazy ones, they're supposed to give with an open heart to certain things to help. So it isn't necessarily like they're giving to the church, but they can give to other organizations to help improve the status of someone else. So I could technically be of the Islamic faith and think I'm giving to that charity, and guess what? That money going somewhere else. Likewise, you have certain charities that are based within countries. In Germany, for example, they have a couple of charities where the Chancellor of Germany is actually sitting on the board of every incoming Chancellor of Germany sits on it's like the Prime Minister sitting on the Red Cross board. Now, first of all, you already got a PEP on the board, all right? And what's to say that that Prime Minister couldn't filter monies through that charity, for example? That's easy to do. And likewise, in the nations that support the Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they can help, they donate money to these charities, and that's how they fund Al-Qaeda. All right? That's where people get upset when Israel jumps up and down and say, well, we're bombing them because we know that they're doing X, Y, and Z. It's because through their intelligence, they were able to find that they were actually the ones funding these things, and then the international community gets up and up on, oh, they were doing charitable work. No, they weren't. They weren't. That's the reality. The U.S. found that out in Iran, when they couldn't figure out how the Shiite, not the Shiite, I forget what their name, but the rebel forces were getting arms. They couldn't figure it out. It was coming through the charitable drops. What they thought was food. Yeah, it was food. It was a couple pockets of food on the top. You understand? So it tells you in here how you can divert funds from charity on 281. And obviously some monies, we already talked about it, some funds are used to do the good, but only some of that funds, not all of that. Because trust me, all the donations that happen in this world, if they were really being all used for charitable purposes, the world would be a better place, wouldn't you think?
I agree.
Okay, so we could definitely be assured that not all the charitable money that goes to these charities go to where it's supposed to. I mean, some people are just shams, we know that. Some fraudsters are saying that they are charities and it's just pocketing the pocket of the person who's behind the charity. Okay, that might not be for terrorist means, that's just outright fraud. And that happens too. All right, so they actually tell you about some of the uses, and we already talked about them, and some of them are legitimate sham. So you remember I said go through I think it's called Charity Navigate. Anyway, if you put in Navigate Charities, it'll come up in Google, and I bookmarked that too because I run charities through there. And it's always great when people come up with these nice sites so I can check to see before I get a warning from the correspondent bank to say, by the way, do you know who your client is? And I'll say, oh, yes, I do. Right? I can produce all the information that you need. And then I could get the monies to go across. Okay. So, remember, we got all kind of ways to deal with it. We talked about some of the stuff before. Credit fraud. It's easy to use credit cards. You know, we don't think much of when systems get hacked, right? Particularly the banking systems and your information goes elsewhere. You know, why can't I can hack a system to create false credit cards in the unsuspecting customer name. And next thing I know, my terrorist cell in New York has a credit card with your name on it, getting funds. If they do a search, you seem to be a legitimate person, right? It'll never go back to the person who's using it. So they put things like that, and they go into a little detail about it, understand it. I want to let y'all know that kidnapping for ransom, for terrorist financing is a real thing that happens. Okay? It isn't just because people are scared because they have money. It happens. In South America, they use it very well. The constant fear of persons of wealth, not wanting the knowledge of their wealth to get out is real. They do go and attack and they grab their children off the street. And trust me, these people have no fear in killing the person who don't get what they want. And so even in trust, you'll see where people put provisions and say, if this happened, we don't want you to give the money. Just don't worry about it. Because they know that they only gonna keep coming back. All right? And it isn't just in places like South and Central America this is happening. This is happening in the Middle East, for example. It's happening in Asia. They have no qualm about getting the monies from you. And if you don't give me the money, then I will kill you and whoever else needs to be done. It's a real factor that happens. And a lot of it happens and people pay the money and governments don't even know that it's happening. Because if I want to get my loved one back, the one thing I'm not going to do is tell the authorities, because I'm of the view that the authorities are only going to help to kill my family. Particularly like the U.S. government takes the approach that they don't pay ransoms, correct? So if I go and tell the FBI, what do you think will happen? Yeah, they're looking to make the terrorists or whoever, the kidnappers, think that they are actually going to give the money, and they know they're not going to. So that's part of the collateral damage. Your person gets killed, unfortunately. That's part of it, but that's the sad reality of where we are. Because they think that if you continue to pay these kind of persons, you continue to encourage them to do what you embolden them, right? You embolden them to do it more, to do it again. If you get away with it the first time, why you can't get away with it the second time? Right? It's like little kids. You tell them not to do something. Because they only get a little spank, they prepared to try and get on you, right? To see what your response is going to be. They'll see if you're going to be committed to the response that you took with them, right? And when they realize that you're committed, then they say, okay, hold up, mommy ain't, daddy ain't working with me here. I need to change this tactic. Okay. It's the same with adults. All right, we used to say it's the same thing. All right, so we already talked about how we move funds. Funds can be moved. People are used as mules, transport cash. I chuckle with Trump. Hey, no, he worried about above the ground, and he's not thinking about below the ground. All right, they transport the monies into the United States to the underground tunnels that they built. All right, they send it through goods and services. I am shipping 20 cars or 50, how many cars to the U.S.? And so I put it in the piles of the doors or wherever, right? I still get my cash the way I want it. Plus, they sold the goods that they were in. And this happens all over the world. All right? The U.S. isn't unique. It happens everywhere. And so this is why we have controls. We already talked about the alternative remittance systems like Hawalas. Clearly, the Times Square bomber, how he was funded, they sent the money through a Hawala. You know, I thought it was interesting, let's stray because we need a little break. I was watching NCIS. I was like, oh, I wish I could record it. I need to get this particular episode because they dealt with Hawalas. And they talked about how these terrorists had come into Los Angeles to target a particular diplomat there. And the monies had moved through Hawala system. And they went to this place down in South Central LA, a little convenience store. And the people had brought all the monies in that was needed to finance the terrorist activity there through the Hawala. And they explained it in depth, and I thought that was like awesome. I always pick up things like that because when I try to train my staff, they're more interested in watching an NCIS series as opposed to me standing up there talking to them, correct? Okay. It works. Just like my reward system. My people like candy. I know they like candy, so I use rewards. Okay? Competition. They're very competitive. So the first one to finish my test gets a nice prize. It works.
But even with the wallet, I mean, it's necessary in the world because, like we said,
Yes.
there's many poor nations where there's not a proper banking
Right.
system, and or, you know, yes, India has, but India is so large.
It's
and so many
huge.
poor sections where there's no banking, etc.
Right.
Like that. But at some point, like you talked earlier about a cross-border situation.
Yes.
Money is transferred.
Money
How
is
does
transferred.
that, how do they legitimize that? Because if I'm the agent in India and I have an agent in the US or Brazil or wherever, the two agents have to get monies to each other. It's a unspoken agreement for a while where you run up a debt, so
Right.
to speak. And then at some point you have to cross the funds.
Yeah. At some point, some of the agents actually use the financial system.
Correct.
Others don't. I mean, it comes in when they send goods. They send goods. And usually with Hawalas,
A barter system
it's
almost,
it's like a
okay,
barter
okay.
system.
Okay.
All right. The first banks are based on barter systems.
Right.
And so that's how Hawalas were built. And unfortunately, it's kind of hard to do away with them, like you correctly said. You have places where you don't have that structure in place where people could have debit cards, right? I mean, one of the things that we stopped doing nowadays is we've moved to almost a cashless system, right? I don't know about y'all, but I put my debit card up for everything. I don't hardly ever carry cash with me anymore. And I'd be totally mad when they tell me the system is down. All right? Because I don't have no cash. I need you to run my card. All right? But they don't have that ability to. You could see somebody who's in the remote parts of India saying, oh, by the way, can you run my card? They're like, what? They don't even know what you're talking about. They understand cash or barter system. And so that's how Hawalas are based, and it works. I mean, it's an honest system, surprisingly, right? The Chinese used it for years and continue to use it. All right? It's hard to regulate those type of things. In the U.S., they don't actually prohibit Hawalas. It's just that you need to be licensed to do it. You have to get some sort of approval from the regulatory body in the area that you are living to do it. The guys who were with the Times Square bomber, they had applied to get the license, but because they didn't get the license, they ignored it and continued to do what they was doing. All right? So they still serve some time in jail, but they didn't serve as much time as probably they would have. All right? So these are things that will always be there. Alternative remittance systems. Money exchanges, they do it all the time, where I go in, MoneyGram and other places like that, Western Union, they never used to do any due diligence. Now you go in, they want 2 forms of ID, they wanna know who the person is,
Bank statement.
everything, you know? But because these are the systems were being used to transport money, and without, they fall under the radar. Alright, and so you'll see why Cash and Go, when they do there, you go in there, they want to have your ID, please. And they want to know who it is that's supposed to collect it on the other side. You know, people get upset, oh, well, my money didn't get to my client, whoever, my cousin. You know, unfortunately, the Bahamas Island, we have 700 islands spread across how much water? You close down the actual banking system on the island, how else are people gonna get money? There gotta be some way, you can figure out a way for them to get money. All right?
Question, how is the challenge that we have, for example, locally with our gambling now being regulated, yet our Canadian banks, for example, oppose this for the obvious reason, infiltrating
Use money.
that were illegal and money laundering and all of that. In Canada and in various states in the US, you now have legalized marijuana. How is that being impacted with the legislation? Because now the funding funds being earned by legitimate businesses now in the marijuana business.
They're required to do certain due diligence. Now, one of the things, even in Canada, whilst they have legislation in place and they have to do certain AML KYC requirements in terms of they have to keep records, they have to know who they're dealing with, that sort of thing. You know, it's interesting that the Canadian banks take the view that they did, right? Once they legalize them, right, it's kind of hard to say now that the money is tainted. What you need to make sure is that these places actually have in place proper AML procedures to track and make sure that they know where the funds are coming from. You know, you'll see now that when people open up their accounts at the gaming houses now, that they're required to, they may ask them to bring in a payslip. They will make sure that that's where them funds are coming from. You know what I mean? But, you know, I always think it's interesting that they take the position. They wanted us to legalize it, and then they could tell us, well, by the way, you can't have a bank account. How much money technically was going through those systems anyway? I mean, let's be real. If I won money at one of the gaming houses in the past before it was legalized, where do you think I was going to put it? In my bank account. In my bank account, it wasn't with the number houses. It was with these same Canadian institutions. They didn't know that part of the money that I was putting in there came from the winnings. You know, that's what cracks me up. I mean,
but how does our legislation and our banks, a private bank today, if an individual came from from Canada, for example, or wherever, saying they have legitimate
you need to make sure they're supposed to be licensed, remember?
Over here, based on our laws, considering marijuana is not legal here,
It's about to be. Let's put it like that.
But is that a block for us in our banking field here or not really?
It's
Because
not technically a block because we have to do our KYC and due diligence. Obviously, it would mean that if they're legal in their jurisdiction, you need to make sure that they have the proper licensing and they're adhering to the licensing requirement. It could be argued that, and I'm sure law enforcement will say, well, technically, it's not legal here, but it's legal in their jurisdiction. Remember, most of the legislation said it has to be a crime in your jurisdiction as well as the other place. If it's not a crime in the other place, how then do you enforce that provision? It's not, you don't have a corresponding offense unless they go outside, they're doing it without a license. Then that becomes another issue. So if you take on a client who has one of these marijuana businesses, and you haven't made sure that they're licensed in their state where they're required to do it because it's legalized there, then you're helping them to create the offense that's in your jurisdiction. You see what I'm saying? So it's all about doing your KYC and your due diligence. That's always what it comes back down to. And understanding if it's legal there, what is the requirement? Might mean you have to do some research to make sure that you stick within your policy. Or your policy may need to be expanded to include that. That's something you may have to think about. You know, in in the last chapter of the unit what you're going to do with me is risk assessment. You have to risk assess that. What are the risks to your business? How are you mitigating the risk? Correct? Remember that AML, KYC, CFT regimes isn't meant that you cannot operate. It just means that you have to operate knowing, one, what are the risks, and what are you doing to mitigate the risks so you don't get in trouble. Okay? It isn't meant, people say, oh, they're only trying to shut us down. It's really, no, they want you to operate in a particular type of environment. That's really what it is. Okay? So that's why it's always important to understand the dual use of goods and services, right? So the person who has, let's look at Checkers. Everybody knows that Mr. Cartwright have a number of Checkers outlets. It's a cash-intense business, right? I go in, and most of the time I pay for my lunch in cash. I'm not swiping it, I pay in cash. But you need to make sure that the actual profits match up with the full revenue with your accounting when it all balances out. You can't say that you're bringing in $2 million in business, but when I look at your sales, you're not making $2 million in sales. How is that possible? That won't work out. I'm no accountant, but the figures don't add up to me. So therefore, that's why it's always important. Remember, most goods have some kind of dual purpose. They can be used in a lot of ways. And so you have to understand, that's why you have to understand the product, understand the business and source of funds, source of wealth. Remember that source of wealth is how you accumulate your wealth. And source of funds is the actual fund that's coming into you, right? Okay, geez. So they talk about the risks here. We're going to go into some of those risks later. But read it, understand some of the risks, because when we do the unit on risk assessment, you'll understand it. They talk about geographical, customer risks as part of your risk assessment. Remember, we just talked about that. Understanding that part of your risk assessment is making, you would risk rate certain countries. I would risk rate certain countries that I know are known for terrorist activities. They're going to be high, right? I'm going to do more due diligence. I might be more concerned. I'm going to do enhanced due diligence for those high-risk ones, right? I'm going to look at customer risk. What type of business? Is it a cash-intensive business? What kind of business? Do I get the financials to be able to understand this is your sales and this is your revenue? How's this balancing out? Should I be concerned? Do I have to write to the FIU and say, hold on, something going on here? All right? So read about it, understand it. It's at the end of the chapter there. We went into already some of the issues or topics that they cover under sanctions under 7. So we've already covered part of 7. We'll just go into some of the things that they're trying to deter against. We talked about that too. And we're just looking into more about how we utilize the sanctions. What does FATF require, and how, in next class, what are we doing to monitor our relationships? What are we doing AML? And how we risk assess. Because most of you who are attached to a regulator, and the Financial Transaction Reporting Act requires even the non-designated financial institutions, so the lawyers, the accountants, to do risk assessments, right? Of your enterprise risk as well as your customer risk, correct? Or your AML risk. Central bank, I'm required on an annual basis to do as part of my corporate governance requirement. I have to indicate whether or not I've done a further annually I've done that risk assessment enterprise and I'm an AML CFP and what are those concerns that I have, and how I risk rated it in terms of what my organization is doing because we rated that high. So we're gonna go into all of that next class. If you have any questions, let me know. Couple things I asked you guys to do. Go and look up some of the things that we talked about. Google is a beautiful thing. Look at the agreement, the actual agreement between the UK and the US on using the terrorist tracking database is actually on, it'll take you to the, I guess it'll be a Treasury site. It's a quick reference PDF that they pull up. It'll actually give you a better synopsis that's in the chapter on what it's all about. So, yay. Thank you very much. See you guys next class. Yes, I'll bring it next week.
The agreement is between the UK and the US on all of terrorism law.
It's the use of the US terrorist tracking database. So the US track every terrorist and they're updating it on a regular basis. Yeah, and a lot of countries have entered similar agreements with the US to utilize that. Interpol uses it. Saudi uses it. All up on it. She left. My dad turned 85 the day before.
But it's
getting
more intense.
Yeah. But, you know, if you don't know and she's known you for a long time, then you would never know. You know, it'll only be when she starts asking you the same questions over and you start to
Keeps it calm.
But he's fighting us because he feels that he's supposed to be taking care of her. And we have a nurse that comes in a couple days of the week. We can't get him to agree to other days. But I have to call him and say, leave the house, please. Give you a break, get him.
He's still driving.
He's still driving. I don't know how much longer, but we'll see. You know, he picks up the girls. But you know, with age comes slowing down. You know, sometimes you get a little shaking in the hand, but other than that, he's good. Some people us. Yeah. Yeah, but he like that. My brother is good. Yeah. Nephews. I don't know if you remember my little nephew that I used to bring when I was at Credit Suisse. He's what? Next week, yeah.
Good day, everyone.
I have no idea.
Sorry about that.
I'm almost fine.